I want to begin this segment with a thank you for the patience of both my regular viewers and the large number of people who have subscribed since I posted my last video. You see, unless I'm making a car book review or it's a maintenance service interval, I have to wait until something on the car breaks before I can then produce a new video about how I went about fixing it. Well, fortunately or not, a red light came on the dash that would indicate that something was wrong with the alternator or maybe with the battery. Then I noticed that as the engine speed increased, the light would flicker and go out. Even if it wasn't the serpentine belt on the alternator slipping, my log showed I hadn't changed it in 100,000 miles. It was time for a new belt. I decided to also replace the tensioner, the adjustment rod, the hydraulic damper, and got all three of them from my favorite local auto parts store. The tensioner has a pulley wheel and a rubber bushing inside the aluminum housing that at the center has a steel shaft with two flats on it to accommodate the adjustment rod. It didn't take long looking at the shop manual pages to realize that there were going to be many bolts of different sizes that were holding on pulleys and brackets, and so I got out some cards and I wrote down what the component was that the bolt would come off of, what step it would come off at, and how many bolts of that size would go in it. Then I put all of those cards into Ziploc bags so that I could easily and quickly organize the parts as I took them off the car. To begin getting access to the front of the engine, I'd have to remove this two-piece fan shroud, the inner circular part. You remove this clip and then you rotate it to the right to unlock it from the flat square portion. You should remove the flat plastic cover at the top of the radiator so you can get even better access. Just pinch the clip and pull on the ring, and then that round shroud will rotate and you can push it towards the engine. This gives you better access to the flat part close to the radiator. Now that's held in by two metal clips. Just pry them up with a flat bladed screwdriver, and then you can pull that whole flat shroud straight up off of its mounts on the radiator. The fan blades are held to the fan clutch by three 5mm Allen screws. When you take them out, be sure to put them in the plastic bag. I had to remove two pulleys, one on the water pump and the other one on the power steering. Now both of these pulleys are held in by three 13mm bolts, but the water pump pulley is concave. You can kind of see the 13mm bolts in there. I'm going to use a deep socket and a breaker bar that I'm now going to wedge against that fan clutch, so that I have a way to clamp that pulley while I use a regular ratchet to loosen up each one of those bolts. I'll move the breaker bar around and the ratchet around as each bolt comes loose. You may want to put a small piece of cardboard to protect the radiator because you're applying a lot of force in a very narrow space, and if you slip, you can easily damage the radiator, so be very careful. Now once you got your bolts out, don't forget to put them in your baggies to organize them for later. The power steering pulley is identical to the water pump one, it's just flipped around backwards, so it's convex, you can get at the bolts. I'm going to use a flat blade screwdriver wedged in there in order to clamp the pulley while I loosen up the bolts the same way that I did with the water pump pulley. Now with the bolts all removed, the belt goes slack and I can just reach in and pull out that power steering pulley. I'm going to use a mirror again to get the first glance at the large bolt that holds in the tensioner to its bracket. It is just down and to the right of the water pump, and it's going to need a 10mm hex drive socket to get it out. So let's get the water pump pulley out of the way and see what other bolts we have to remove. Well, here's the main bolt that holds the tensioner, and if you decide to clean the dirt off, be very careful of that front crank position sensor with the wire coming out of it. I'm going to remove the upper bolt on the hydraulic damper, and on the right hand side the two small bolts that hold the bracket so I can pivot that up and out of the way. The adjustment rod bolt is between the thermostat housing and the power steering reservoir. I've left the third bracket bolt behind the fan clutch as a pivot so I can just raise that bracket up and wiggle the damper and the tensioner and take them out as one unit from underneath. This gives me plenty of room for the 11mm wrench I'll need to detach the hydraulic damper from the tensioner unit. I'll need it later to attach the new damper to the new tensioner. Notice the two indents on the adjustment rod face the tensioner and the flat side faces towards the engine. The tensioner gauge marks that are cast in the housing are the same color as the housing, so I'm going to use this red marker to highlight this sort of triangle and the two end marks that are on the tensioner housing. Now the tension indicator gauge has a pointer. I save it from the old tensioner and attach it to the new one at the very lowest end of the scale. It's going to be the sharp point of the triangle on the side. You need it to look like this when it starts out. The first bolt I put back on is the one for the hydraulic damper with its flat washer to attach it to the new tensioner. I'm going to snug it down, but I want it to be able to move a little bit, give me some leeway. The flats on the back of the main shaft of the tensioner will match the indents on the tensioner rod. The smooth side is going to face the engine block. I put the tensioner rod nut back into its bracket, and while holding the tensioner in my right hand, I'm going to slip that tensioner rod up behind it and behind the bracket. Now I can wiggle the new tensioner and the hydraulic damper back into place. Tightening the tension rod nut helps hold the assembly in place. Next is the upper right bracket bolt. I'll just tap that a little bit to get it seated. Now, I put the upper attachment bolt for the hydraulic damper in now so that between that and the tensioner rod and its nut, it sort of suspends the new tensioner behind the bracket and makes it a little easier for me to line all of the other bolts up. Next up is the main center bolt through the tensioner. I'm going to get that attached but not torque it yet. Some unscheduled fun was provided by the non-captured nut for the lower right-hand bracket bolt, which I proceeded to drop multiple times behind the power steering fluid reservoir before I smartened up and used a magnet in one of the fingers of my gloves to create an articulated magnetic pickup tool. It worked like a charm and really saved the day. Soon it was time to raid the other bolt baggies and start putting the pulleys back on, starting with the power steering pump. I held that pulley from spinning with the old flat blade screwdriver ploy. But I had to hold the water pump pulley hard enough to torque it with a strap wrench because there wasn't any way I was going to get inside that concave pulley and hold it tight with a flat blade screwdriver. I now took a few minutes so that I could have a really good look at this really bad belt that was cracked and crazing at the back. It was glazed on the side, and it turned out that it was actually missing 2 rows of ribs. If I had planned on getting around town much longer with a belt like this, I would need a bus ticket. Well, the new belt looks great, and you can see there's printing on the top of it, and we want to face that so you can read it from the front. Just snake it around and start to line it up on the pulleys. Just follow the pulley diagram on the cardboard sleeve it was packed in. Once the belt is properly routed over the pulleys, we can start to run the tensioner nut down. Notice the pointer on the lower left of the screen as it rises. You want it to stop about halfway up the triangle, and that will be the proper tensioning for the belt to start. With the belt all set where it needs to be, it's time to torque down that large center bolt in the middle of the brand new tensioner. Now, this particular bolt is important enough that it has a very specific torque to it, so make sure you set your wrench to 75 Newton meters. That's on the metric scale of your wrench. Now, the plastic engine fan looks symmetrical, but there's actually a front and a back to it, so make sure that you have the side labeled front facing the radiator, and then get your 3 5mm hex bolts, put them in, and you can reattach it right to that fan clutch. Just spin it around the same way that you took it off. With the fan firmly attached, it's time to look for the tabs on the bottom of the square shroud. These are going to line up with the slots in the little tabs at the bottom of the radiator. Just slip it straight down. The inner ring portion of the shroud slots right into place and rotates back. Be sure to replace the clip. And put the flat, long plastic cover on top of the radiator. You're ready to start it up and see that it works. And it does work. And it doesn't look bad. It had taken a little longer than I thought it would, but by the time I cleaned up my tools and looked outside, it was still a sunny day, so I decided to hit the highway. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.